March 13th, 2025 general membership meeting of the Pacific Coast Archaeological Society. Tonight we have Dr. Duncan McLaren. Title of his talk is Alpine Obsidian Quarries and Perishable Artifacts from the Mount Edziza Volcanic Complex in Canada. Dr. McLaren received his PhD from the University of Victoria. He owns and operates Cordilla Archaeology Incorporated, a company that conducts archaeological research and consulting in Western Canada. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of Victoria. McLaren specializes in the archaeology and paleoecology of the Canadian Northwest Coast and Western subarctic regions of North America. Everybody gives a warm welcome to you, Dr. McLaren. Thank you for joining us, and I'm going to turn the meeting over to you. All yours.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to join you and your meeting today and to provide some information on the research we've been conducting in northern BC. And as I mentioned earlier, the work that we're doing is in the high alpine and areas where there's snow year-round and ice year-round. And many people kind of think of the alpine as a deserted place where there's not many resources and not much action, and that gets portrayed back into the past. But one thing that we find, even in these more northerly latitudes, alpine areas were used extensively, and were a place where people could go and get resources, either hunting, plant gathering, or in the case of Mount Edziza, the primary reason for being in the alpine was to gather obsidian. Okay, I'm going to move on here. I'll give you a little background. Alpine ice is retreating with warming climatic conditions. Ancient perishable artifacts can be preserved in ice for thousands of years. The Kitsu Plateau of the Mount Edziza Volcanic Complex is an alpine area that was attractive to people in the past as it is densely covered with dudat or obsidian. Dudat is the Tahltan name for obsidian. So the Kitsu Plateau is situated in the center of Tahltan Territory. Tahltan are Athabascan-speaking people, and their territory is quite a large area in northern BC. There's evidence of archaeological materials from sites in Alaska, in the Yukon, and in BC that the obsidian from Mount Edziza has been mined and transported and traded for over 11,000 years. Some of the late Pleistocene sites in Alaska and the Yukon have obsidian, but it's not Mount Edziza obsidian. It seems to appear a little later, around 11,000 years. And some of that may have to do with the elevation of the source. In 2019, an initial examination of ice patches around the obsidian quarries found over 50 perishable artifacts that had melted out of the ice. In 2024, these ice patches were revisited once again and further objects were found. Some new ice patches were also surveyed in 2024. So this is a map of Tahltan Territory, and to the west is the coast of Alaska and the Alaska Panhandle. And Mount Edziza here is Mount Edziza Park is this green area. I don't know, can you see my cursor there?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Mount Edziza is a fairly large volcanic complex, and it's this is the park around it. Major drainage is the Stikine River, and this flows this way down here and then flows out into the Pacific Ocean at Wrangell, Alaska. And inset gives you an idea of the location of the territory. So this work was done and also sponsored by the Tahltan central government, as well as BC Parks. It's a physiographic map showing where major ice fields are, these white areas, and Mount Edziza is just kind of tucked in behind the coast mountain, the highest peaks of the coast mountains. So the Kitsu Plateau is amongst the largest archaeological sites known in Canada. In the 1980s, initial archaeological documentation of the Kitsu Obsidian Quarries occurred. And this is a statement that the archaeologist Knut Fladmark at the time had about the area. He said, "Here, every non-vertical area not covered by snow seems to possess some scatter of obsidian. For instance, obsidian flakes were noted essentially continuous in the course of a 4 to 5 kilometer walk across the central plateau. Obsidian that has been transported and traded away from the source can be traced back to its source using XRF technology, and this has been done by Rudy Reimer as well as earlier researchers. And so we have a fairly good handle on the distance that this obsidian has been traded. Radiocarbon dated archaeological contexts in Alaska, the Yukon, and Alberta containing transported Kitsu obsidian demonstrate that it has been mined and traded for at least 11,000 years. Most of the archaeological sites in Tahltan Territory include high frequencies of Kitsu obsidian artifacts, with many sites being 100% composed of these. In 2019, the Tahltan Central Government Lands Department and BC Parks funded initial research on ice patches situated on the Kitsu Plateau. And over 50 perishable artifacts were found. Radiocarbon dates on these objects demonstrate that they have been frozen for up to 7,000 years. This is a slide that shows the book that was published by Knut Fladmark, who did the initial archaeological survey of the obsidian quarries. And this is actually available online for free, Glass and Ice, the Archaeology of Mount Edziza. And as it's in the Alpine and there's not a lot of vegetation, most of the obsidian is just visible on the surface. There's not much in terms of active mining or pits dug or anything like that, because there's just so much of the material available on the surface. This is my colleague in the middle, Brendan Gray. He's just holding a big piece of obsidian. And here you can see sometimes the obsidian has been almost put into a band by melting snow. We figure that the obsidian's transported down and this kind of river of obsidian effect occurs. And it's a mix of natural as well as flaked obsidian. This shows in red here, the boundary of Mount Edziza Park and archaeological sites around and in the park that have obsidian. So this is the Stikine River here, a very dense concentration of archaeological sites, and most of the material in these sites is obsidian. We found this is one of the spear points that Fladmark found, and it's beautiful collateral oblique flaking, and also this, which appears to be a fluted projectile point found in a surface context on the Stikine River. Another type of artifact that's very common are these obsidian microblades, and there's some debate as to when they date to, but we tend to find them in all time periods that we look at. And So they're sort of a very long-term and strategy for maximizing raw material. Presumably, as the Edziza Obsidian is located in the Alpine, it's only accessible really in the summer. So you have to make sure you gather enough and have it year round. And if you're running low, you may revert to microblade production to maximize your cutting edges. This is a map here, shows the extent of obsidian from the Kitsu Plateau, how far it's been traded. So quite far in the east to the Saskatchewan border, up into the Northwest Territories, the Yukon, coastal Alaska, and right down to the area around Vancouver. Interestingly, on southern Vancouver Island here, most of the obsidian we see there comes from Oregon. So this is a paper by Rudy Reimer, published in the Journal of Archaeological Science, and his work conducting XRF analysis in the park. Ultimately, there's not been a lot of archaeological work in Tahltan Territory. I think we did this analysis looking at trying to bring together all the dates on archaeological sites, and we could only find 52 radiocarbon dated archaeological sites. Our team has produced half of those. And so in a lot of ways, there's not much in terms of known in terms of the local culture history. But that's one benefit of the perishable artifacts, is that you can directly date them. Some examples of some of the obsidian artifacts that we find at the quarries. And one thing that we find is that they tend to have been producing these very large obsidian bifaces at the quarries. So this is what would be produced at the quarry, and then these would be packed out in baskets or packed out in bags of some sort as large bifaces. On the left here, you can see these are obsidian bifaces that were found in Tagish, Yukon, but they're from these are from Mount Edziza. So this is how they were transported out, and also how they would have been traded. And this isn't unique. We also find other materials. This is a cache of andesite bifaces. Obviously, someone hiked these out of, produced these at the quarry and hiked them out, made a cache, and never came back for it. It's quite a common way of transporting raw material. Now, our work in Mount Edziza follows in the footsteps of really groundbreaking work at ice patches in the Yukon, conducted by Gregory Hare and his colleagues. And their focus is on ice patches where caribou hang out. And so in the summer months, bugs in the alpine can be really bad. The caribou will retreat onto these ice patches to keep the bugs at bay. And the only problem with that is they also became sort of sitting ducks for people. And one thing they're finding at these caribou ice patch sites is there's lots of hunting weaponry with projectile points still in their hafted. And you can see how they've been hafted. Here's a clothespin type haft. Interestingly, a lot of the atlatl darts that they do find are in sections. The shafts are in sections. And you can see this is a curved section here and would have joined with another section. Sometimes they're really lucky and they'll still find the stone projectile point in them. As I said previously, radiocarbon dates in the area go back as far as 9,000 years in the Yukon from these ice patch sites, and then every millennia right up until historic times. and they do see a major transition from atlatl to bow and arrow technology at 1200 years ago. And so we knew that Mount Edziza had this obsidian from Fladmark's work, and we knew in the Yukon that they were finding a lot of perishable artifacts in where there were these caribou hunting sites. And so we reasoned that Mount Edziza, with the obsidian and also with the ice, that there should be perishable artifacts coming out of the ice that's related not necessarily to hunting, but to obsidian quarrying. And Fladmark never found any perishable materials in the work he did on Mount Edziza. When we look at his photos from the 1980s when he was working there, there was considerably more snow. So we know the ice patches have shrunk since that time. Ice patches come in several different shapes and forms, and in this case, they're very thin and ephemeral. But these particular ice patches still have perishable materials around them. You won't find perishable materials greater than about 20 meters from these ice patches. And at that point, I guess they just degrade. Just also draw your attention to this ridge. All this black material here is obsidian on top of this ridge. It's looking down from same area onto this ridge, and here you can see all this scattered black material is all obsidian, and most of it has been worked. And then here an ice patch, and under this there are some perishable objects coming out. You'll note that there's no trees in sight. We're well above the tree line, so any piece of wood that we find, we inspect because it's most likely brought there by people. We find these amazing obsidian working stations where people were sitting and napping out probably those large bifaces, maybe blade cores, and just leaving the flakes behind. It's one of the first perishable objects we found in 2019, and it's a walking staff. And this staff is being held here by George Dennis, who's from the Tahltan First Nation, lives in the village of Iskut. And you may ask, well, that just looks like a stick to me. Well, note that it tapers at the bottom. It has been carved at the bottom. Another thing that we find is that you can really see that it's been crushed at the base, where, of course, you place the walking stick. This particular object comes back with a date of around 2,500 years. And walking sticks are one of the most common things that we find on the ice or below the ice. In this case, you can see this stick here right on the ice. And this particular walking staff dates 7,000 years old. Interestingly, there's this archival photo, which we found in the BC archives in Victoria, BC, and it says, calls the photo Tahltan's on the way to the hunt. And here you can see a walking staff. Very similar to the ones that we find tapering at the bottom and wider at the top. So just show you that everyone's wearing moccasins as well, boots made from animal hide. This is a different type of ice patch, again from 2019. You can see the yearly layers of snow that then turned to ice and then became convoluted later in time. This particular ice patch, we found some of the older materials dating back 6,500 years old. And this particular ice patch is one of the more productive ones. You can see there's a really black or dark colored ice, and that's contrasted with this recent snow that's on top of it. And the ancient ice is this black colored ice. So not unlike the work in the Yukon, we started to find some hunting gear, hunting equipment. Here's a atlatl foreshaft, dates just a little older than 2,000 years old. Interestingly, though, it's not curved like the Yukon examples. This one has tapered end and seems to have fit into some kind of slot. So it's a little bit different technology than what they're seeing in the Yukon. Number of different antler tools. This very similar to an ice pick, and this is a wooden point. You can see it's clearly been carved. I have a better picture of it in the next slide, dating around 6,000 years old, and some chopped caribou antler here. Another type of object that we find as well are antler billets that were being used for working obsidian. This is that wooden point that I showed in the previous image, and you can see on the point here there's all these transverse cut marks. We're not exactly sure what these are from, perhaps some kind of hafting or something like that. I was quite surprised that this is quite a well-known type of point, and they all seem to have these little cut marks on them. We also came across some basketry. Here's in the north, they tend to make these birch bark baskets, quite common. Birch bark comes off the tree in nice big slabs, and so it can be folded and stitched. On the right here, you can see there's some stitch marks and even some stitches remaining in this basket fragment. You'll also note here where it's rolled, there's more stitch marks. So we're not exactly sure what shape this basket was, but it's definitely a birch bark basket fragment. Dates, again, just over 2,000 years old. And another more recent birch bark fragment, basket fragment. This is how it was found below the ice patch on the rocks. Pretty rough condition, 1,500 years old. We managed to find this piece of plywood where we're staying so that we could lift it out. And one thing that we found, and this is quite rare, is this basket has been reinforced by stitching in these sticks and on both sides. So it's probably kind of like a big envelope you could carry on your back or with a tump line off your head, and you could fill it with obsidian and be reinforced for the weight of the obsidian. Here you can see this is the same basket. You can see the detail of this stick reinforcement that's stitched in there. Quite a bit of hide. A lot of the hide objects or leather objects we find are just strips of hide. And in this case, the strips are tying together a couple sticks, but we're not sure exactly what the object would have been. About 3,000 years old. This was really quite an amazing object. This is how we found it. It's in very poor condition, and we thought at the time it might be a mitten or a purse or a moccasin or shoe. And so we collected it and took it to the museum in Victoria, where they've been slowly freeze drying it. And I went in there last year to see the progress. It's quite a slow process, and it really looks like it's most likely a moccasin. And you can see the bottom of the moccasin here is this skin that has all these black pores. It's been pinched and sewn along the toe, as you would expect with a moccasin. And we figure that this skin is bear skin, whether grizzly or black bear, not exactly sure, but It's a bear skin soled shoe. If you look at the top of it, there's a thinner red stained skin on top, and this may be marmot. We're not sure. I have some samples into Ancient DNA Lab to help figure that out. Sewn with sinew. Again, this is where it's pinched and sewn. You can see it quite clearly. And here it appears that the moccasin was fur-lined. And we're not sure what kind of fur it was lined with, but we do have samples of the fur into the DNA lab as well. This moccasin is very early, 6,500 years old. So it's quite an exciting find, and we're going to follow up and hopefully at some point publish on this moccasin. Some more recent finds of more recent historic material. This is from an area adjacent to the Edziza complex called the Tahltan Plateau. And our team didn't find this, but it was reported to us by a hunter and his party who found it near an ice patch. And this includes a deuterium shell, which was traded from the coast, as well as glass trade beads and this beautiful antler comb, which each of the forks on the comb has been painstakingly carved. The results from our earlier research in 2019 were published in the Journal of Field Archaeology. So if you want to look more in depth at our work and read about it, you can download that paper. We returned in 2024, so last summer. And here you can see Kenzie and Dennis. They're from the local town of Telegraph Creek. And they're starting off the morning here, walking out towards ice patches. And you can see in the background, Kenzie here is carrying the rifle. Bear protection. And yeah, we were dropped by helicopter for 5 days and pitched our tent in this lovely spot. And we didn't see a bear the whole time, so that was nice. Here we are again finding more wooden walking sticks. These are known in Tahltan as tes, T-E-S. And Dennis is holding one on the left there. In the middle here, Kenzie is thrilled to be excavating one out of the ice. We just saw the end sticking out. And then we packed them for removal to repository. Some of them we removed, and some we just leave. We might sample them for radiocarbon dating, but in terms of long-term storage, they're probably just as good on the mountain as they are being taken out to a museum. Kenzie here lifting a doodad boulder or obsidian boulder. And this is my colleague, Brendan Gray. He's a very talented archaeologist, and he came across an atlatl dart right here beneath this ice patch where he's pointing. And that's the atlatl dart. It's unfortunately missing the point, which would be here. And this isn't one of these short section curved atlatl shafts. It's just a one-piece shaft, and here you can see wrapping. We're not sure what it's wrapped with, but this is wrapped for attaching fletching or feathers. And next slide here shows this wrapping in detail, and there's even remnants of the feathers left here, or fletching. And interesting, the stem of the feathers have been sliced so that they rest flush with the atlatl shaft. A very exciting find. We haven't we haven't got our radiocarbon date results back for this yet, but yeah, so very unique for us. I've never come across anything like this, so quite exciting. A number of other objects, like piece of leather strapping, uh, bone, caribou antler, sorry, and we figure this might be a billet as well as punch, and here birch bark basket fragments. Plenty of obsidian blade cores. So there are blade cores up there. They're not as common as the big bifaces, but yeah, we do see blade cores up there. It's a nice black obsidian, but obsidian in the same area can be different colors. And here there's a gray blue obsidian. We see green obsidian and orange, red, brown, and pretty much any color you can think of. However, the vast majority of it is black. Spent quite a bit of time mapping flaking stations, just where there's big piles of flakes where someone sat down and worked out either blade cores or large obsidian bifaces. This is obsidian core, 40 centimeters, 50 centimeters wide, so a big piece of obsidian. And on the last day, we did some helicopter survey and checked out a few of the passes around Mount Edziza, where there's further ice patches, as well as some other ridges, and found more obsidian and also more perishable materials. So there is no shortage of ice patches out there, and it's kind of mind-boggling how much perishable materials there might be in these ice patches. One thing we find is a lot of the obsidian workstations are located in a place with a really good view. And so you could do two things at one time. You could be essentially making your materials that you're going to hike out from obsidian, and you can be watching for game at the same time, looking out, seeing if there's a mountain goat that appears or caribou. This is a place known as Artifact Ridge, and we also checked out a place that's called Obsidian Ridge. And in both places, we found obsidian artifacts and, again, more perishable artifacts. Here, Brendan's pointing to a carved wooden staff or a spear that was found on Artifact Ridge. Artifact Ridge is, as far as we know, never had an archaeological survey, but the valley below has, and it has numerous archaeological sites below the tree line, and they're all full of obsidian. And so, probably people weren't spending a lot of time in the Alpine. They'd come up, they'd get their obsidian. You don't want to camp too often or for very long in the Alpine. You don't have any wood to start a fire and keep warm, so that's where all the camping was happening, was just below the tree line. So there's lots of archaeological sites just below the tree line. Here you can see below where the tree line is. This crew that we had last year and the helicopter pilot, it was excellent. And everywhere you look, there's more ice. So the potential out there is huge. Significance. Despite there being more snow on the ground in 2024 than in 2019, we still found numerous perishable artifacts. And the ice patch sites continue to melt and will likely continue to melt more in the future if warming climatic conditions continue. The distribution of doodat or obsidian across Tahltan Territory is extremely significant for Tahltan rights and title, as it demonstrates the physical remains of ancestral use and occupancy. This research has bearing on the Tahltan right to mine and Tahltan land title in particular. Several acknowledgements here, in particular for the Tahltan central government and BC Parks, who provided funding for this work. And this is just a photo of some of the brilliant mountain landscapes that surround the Mount Edziza Volcanic Complex. And I'm happy to take any questions if anyone's still there.
Yes, sir. I got one. This is Al Knight.
Hi, Al.
I'm not familiar particularly with northern British Columbia, but it appears that the area you're discussing is drains, I believe you said, down to the Alaska Panhandle area. Is the entire area more oriented toward the ocean? Is there much orientation toward the interior? I know you're not dealing with ancient dates there, but we have the going debate between the migrating into North America through Canada, through the Yukon, and down into the plains versus coming down the coast, the so-called Kelp Highway. Do you see anything up there in the area you're studying that suggests a old connection to the interior versus the coast? Again, I assume the more recent stuff is oriented toward the coast, but what's your long-term prognosis? Which side did the people that lived in that area come from, let's say?
Well, they speak a language that's Athabascan, which occurs both on the coast and the interior of that area. So they're very closely allied and related with the Coast Tlingit, but they're also very closely related to the interior Athabascan groups. And I know that there's this big coast interior divide, in particular when you start looking at the peopling issue. But, there was a lot of contact and movement from the interior to the coast and vice versa, and a lot of influence both ways.
So is this kind of an intermediate group? The distribution of the obsidian you showed covers the coast and quite a ways into Alberta. So are they any evidence they were middlemen making a little profit off of all this trade?
Definitely, that's a big part of at least the historic and ethnographic record is that Tahltan were definitely middlemen. The Russians had a fort at Wrangell called Fort Dionysius, and so they played middlemen with the Tlingit, who essentially had controlled the trade on the coast, and the Kaska, who were further to the east. So, it's interesting history. In terms of late Pleistocene archaeology, we don't have a grip on that in Tahltan Territory. An interesting sort of side note is a very well excavated and documented site in Alaska, Swan Point, probably has one of the best, probably the earliest record in Alaska at 14,100 years ago, with a unique microblade complex, at least in North America, but which relates to a contemporaneous microblade producing culture in Siberia, Dyuktai. And these distinct microblade cores appear in Alaska, and then they disappear. They appear about 14,100 years ago. By 13,500, that technology is gone. It continues in Siberia, however. But then we do find that those types of microblade cores in Tahltan Territory. And so it's probably, from what we can tell, they're more of an early Holocene. They're being used more in the early Holocene in Tahltan Territory, but it could be a continuity of that technology. Certainly, coast of Alaska, you'd want to be looking in the outer coastal areas if you're going to be looking for early sites.
interesting stuff.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Here's a question for you. How were these sites formed? Were these things that were left behind, people planned to come back and get them the next year after the snow melted, or was there 10 years of snow when they gave up on that area and went somewhere else?
I think there's several processes, and one of them is, if you lose something and the wind comes up and it's a whiteout with snow or whatever, you lose your moccasin, maybe you have an extra pair, and so you throw those on. Apparently, people did travel with extra pairs of moccasins because you don't have a rubber sole. They do tend to wear out fairly quickly. The basket parts, I can imagine that they may have blown away and got trapped in the ice. The walking sticks is a little harder to understand why you'd leave your walking stick behind, but people do leave their walking sticks all over the place. So yeah, that might be what's going on there. But things can change very quickly in the Alpine. Like, you can be up there, it's quite nice. We were up there like in July 28th, so middle of summer, and it was snowing sideways, and fairly uncomfortable. And so if you're getting out of somewhere quickly, you may leave lots of things behind that you hadn't expected to. For whatever reason, it then gets encapsulated in the ice. I don't think people were leaving stuff intentionally to be covered by the ice. It just gets covered and you get separated from it, and over thousands of years it accumulates in that ice. That's slightly different from what they're looking at in the Yukon, where there's hunting sites. So there maybe some of that going on in Mount Edziza as well. And certainly there's hunting gear, and if you lose your atlatl in the snow, or you're tracking a caribou, you'll leave that atlatl there, and you'll go after the wounded caribou. And so that essentially that hunting gear gets lost. It's part of hunting, right?
Yeah, the idea of leaving a walking stick behind seemed odd, but I guess if you go down below the tree line, you can get yourself a new one.
Yeah, maybe easier to walk uphill with a stick, and you don't need it to go downhill. So.
Mm-hmm. And another question, you mentioned you could trace this obsidian. How far? Where did it go to?
Where did it go? I did have a map there, but anyways, it is traded to the coast of Alaska, down to the coast of BC to Vancouver, and then across the interior into the Northwest Territories and Alberta. Further south in BC, there's other sources of obsidian, but also we see a lot of obsidian moving northwards from Oregon. I don't know if you have high alpine sources in California, but there are certainly high alpine sources in Oregon and Mexico, even Ecuador. There is some ice patch archaeology going on in Ecuador as well. Even though it's on the equator, it's so high elevation that they do have ice there. There's quite a bit going on in Norway and in Switzerland, places that have mountains with ice. But I'm quite surprised how far south that some of this work's being done.
Yeah, if it's a good source and good material, it'll go far.
Yeah.
And they do track where obsidian ends up in California. They can usually track it back to the source.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I guess my point is, if that source is in the high alpine, there may also be potential for perishable materials as well.
And
there was a question in the comments. I just went by really quickly. Can anyone see that?
Yes. Question from Paul Chase. Does ice slow hydration?
Obsidian hydration, is that the question? Or hydration of the perishable artifacts?
Doesn't say. I'll ask both ways.
Yeah, obsidian hydration, I'm not exactly sure. There's a lot of factors that that will affect obsidian hydration. And we were early on when I started working in Tahltan Territory, I was essentially told not to really bother too much with obsidian hydration. But quite interestingly, there was a researcher in the late 1960s who did some excavations and did quite a bit of obsidian hydration. And based on that work, he said, well, this site was occupied between 4,000 and 9,000 years old. So we went in and found his excavation units. He hadn't backfilled them. We took some column samples and we took some radiocarbon dates, and we get dates the same span. It's quite amazing. Yeah. In terms of the hydration of the perishable artifacts, they are really heavy and wet when they come out of the ice. If they just melted out of the ice, they're really heavy and wet, and they begin to dry very quickly once they're out of the ice. And over the 5-year period between when we went and then we went back, we find objects we'd found before that had melted out, but we hadn't collected, and they were essentially delaminating because it becomes so dry. There's a lot of moisture in those artifacts when they first come out of the ice. So it can be a challenge for curation and preservation.
Yeah. I would suppose it's similar to sunken wooden ships. They take the wood out of the ocean. It quickly deteriorates when they bring it out in the air.
Yes, that's correct. And we, in some parts of BC, they're waterlogged sites. Probably you have those in California too, where we'll have basketry, absolutely saturated basketry encased in clay, and can be preserved for up to 10,000 years. We've found some wet sites that have preserved wooden materials in them. But again, as soon as you get them out of the ground, they start to change and start to oxidize, and so the clock starts ticking. In some cases, in the alpine, the artifacts have dried, but they haven't started to crumble or delaminate into dust, and so it's almost like it's curated for you. So yeah, that's quite nice if you get it at the right point.
Okay. With that, ask the audience, are there any other questions? None. Joe, are you still with us?
Did want to say that it was excellent talk.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Joe, are you still with us?
Yes, I am.
There you are. You'd like to finish up?
Yep. Does anybody have any questions?
Apparently none.
Okay. Okay. I have one. What's the farthest? I know you mentioned they're spread far and wide, but what's the farthest you've known this obsidian to have traveled?
In this case, it's probably to the Alberta-Saskatchewan border. That's quite a ways, but I don't know the distance in kilometers or miles. I'm sorry. It's a considerable distance, though.
And all that obsidian pieces that were on the ground, did they mostly get put there by humans, or was that left there from when it was formed?
Well, it's a mixture of the two. They're essentially obsidian quarries. So you have the raw material there, and then over thousands of years, you have people working that raw material, and so it's a mixture of both. And I assume people would also probably pick, if you're there 1,000 years later, you might pick up a big core or flake that someone had made 1,000 years earlier and continue working it.
Okay, anybody else have any questions? Well,
Okay.
did you have one, Stephen?
No,
Okay.
back to you.
We wish to thank you very much, Dr. McLaren, for that. I'm going to be sending you
Oh, no way.
certificate of appreciation. It looks good with obsidian flakes glued around it. Next month is let me get my well, I had it written down here, but misplaced it.
There we go. I assume you're looking for next month's speaker? I've got
Yeah,
it here. Next month's
Who's John?
speaker is
Yeah.
Dr. Marilyn Johnson,
yeah, she's going to be.
speaking on the What is Philosophy of Archaeology?
It's about the future of archaeology in summary, as she sees it. So, hopefully, you can join us. And if there's no other questions, I want to thank Dr. McLaren for his time tonight, and thank you very much for your presentation. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, and have a great evening.
You too. Good night, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Good
Thank
talk.
you.
Thank you
Good
very
night.
much.